On the 8th of January, 1959, a route commission in the city of Sverdlovsk, the place we now call Yekaterinburg, approved a ski expedition into the northern Urals. The paperwork mattered. Soviet mountaineering and ski touring was an organized, certified, bureaucratic pursuit, and the route being approved that day was rated Category 3, which was the highest difficulty grade then in existence. Roughly 300 kilometers on skis over about a fortnight in the deep winter of a subarctic mountain range. If they completed it, the group would qualify for Grade 3 certification, the top of the system. I want that established before anything else, because almost every retelling of this story begins by making these people sound like tourists who wandered into something. They were not. They were among the most qualified winter skiers in the Soviet Union, on a route that a commission of experts had examined and signed off. There were 10 of them at the start. 9 of them died. Let me tell you who they were, because they usually appear in this story only as a body count, and they were people for about 22 years each before they were that. Igor Dyatlov, 23, was the leader. A fifth-year radio engineering student who built his own shortwave sets and carried homemade radio equipment on treks because he wanted to see whether it would work in the mountains. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, also radio engineering, also in her 5th year. By every account, one of the strongest skiers in the group. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, was studying engineering economics. 2 years earlier, on another trek, she had been accidentally shot in the leg by a hunter. She finished that trip. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, radio engineering, 4th year. Rustam Slobodin, 23, had graduated the previous year and was working as an engineer. He brought a mandolin. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, a civil engineer. His surname is French because his father was of French descent. A repressed engineer, which is the Soviet euphemism. Nikolai was born inside a gulag camp. Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, a construction and hydraulics graduate. He played the guitar and was the group's clown. He also worked at a place called Chelyabinsk 40. Hold on to that. It comes back. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a 4th-year nuclear physics student who had previously worked at a secret institute in Moscow. He kept the neatest notes of anyone in the group. And Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, who was the outlier, 15 years older than most of them, a veteran of the Second World War, a professional instructor at a tourist base. He joined the group late. He needed the Grade 3 certification for his career. The 10th was Yuri Yudin, 21. Yudin had a rheumatic heart condition and a recurring inflammation of the sciatic nerve. Somewhere in the days of traveling, some of it in the back of an open truck in January, the nerve flared badly enough that he could not continue. On the morning of the 28th of January, at an abandoned geological settlement called the Second Northern, he turned back. There is a photograph of him embracing Lyudmila Dubinina before he goes. He is smiling. Everyone is smiling. The 9 went on around midday. Yuri Yudin died on the 27th of April, 2013, at the age of 75. He outlived his friends by 54 years and spent a great deal of that time on this case. Here is the journey from their own diaries. Train number 45 left Sverdlovsk at 9:05 in the evening on the 23rd of January. 388 kilometers north to Serov by 6:30 the next morning. Another train that evening to Ivdel. Then a bus, 90 kilometers, to a settlement called Vijay. On that bus, they bought 9 tickets for 10 people, and Dubinina hid under the seats. That is the register of this trip. 9 young people and 1 older one, doing something difficult and slightly serious, and messing about while they did it. On the 26th, they wrote their last letters home and rode 40 kilometers north on a logging truck. On the 27th, a sleigh took them to the second northern, arriving near 11 at night. On the 28th, Yudin turned back. Then they went up the Lozva River, and then the Auspia, on skis, breaking trail through deep snow. Their diaries record the temperatures: -13 on the 29th, -17 on the 30th, falling to -26 that evening. Dyatlov's entry for the 31st of January. Walking is especially hard today. We can't see the trail, have to grope our way. They were too tired that day to build the labaz, the supply cache you leave behind, so you are not carrying 2 weeks of food up a mountain. They built it on the 1st of February instead, which made them start late. And on the 1st of February, they pitched their tent on the slope of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. There is no diary entry for that day. 2 things about that name, because both are usually got wrong. Kholat Syakhl is Mansi, the language of the indigenous people of that region. It is generally rendered as Dead Mountain. You will very often hear it given as Mountain of the Dead, which is a different phrase with a different implication, and which is not what it says. Even Dead Mountain needs care. The Mansi word can mean dead, but it can also mean meager or lacking in game, and it appears in a number of place names across Mansi territory. The most defensible reading is that it is an old name, centuries older than 1959, recording that the mountain is bare and bad for hunting. It does not mean that people died there. It is not an omen. It was just the name of the hill. Similarly, the peak they were heading for, Otorten, is often translated as "don't go there." It almost certainly derives instead from a Mansi phrase, meaning roughly, the mountain the wind blows from. One more piece of housekeeping, and then we can begin properly. Almost everything I'm going to quote tonight, the autopsy findings, the forensic reports, the investigator's own words, exists in the original as Russian. I am working from the standard English translations of the case file. They are good translations, but they are translations. And at 2 or 3 points tonight, the exact English wording is genuinely disputed, and I will tell you when we reach those points. That caveat is not a formality. In this case, more than most, the difference between 2 translations of a single phrase has generated decades of theory. On the 1st of February, they climbed onto the northeastern shoulder of Kholat Syakhl, and about 1,500 meters short of the summit, on an open slope above the tree line, they stopped and made camp. Below them, perhaps a kilometer down and a good descent away, was forest, shelter, firewood. They camped on the bare slope instead. And this is the first decision people find strange. There are three explanations, and I want to be clear at the outset that all three are modern reconstruction. No document from 1959 says why they camped where they did. The first is that it was deliberate technique. If you descend to the tree line, you give back the height you spent all day earning, and you have to climb it again in the morning. Experienced groups often camp high for exactly that reason, and Dyatlov was known to prefer it. The second is that it was training. They were on a certification trek. Making a cold camp on an exposed slope in winter is not an accident on a trip like that. It is one of the skills being certified. The third is that they lost the pass in poor visibility and stopped rather than descend blind in the dark. Any of those is plausible. Anyone who tells you which one it was is guessing. The tent itself matters more than it sounds, so bear with me on the detail, because it becomes the hinge of this entire episode about 60 years later. It was long, 2 tents sewn together, around 4.5 meters. To pitch something that size on a slope, you have to make it level. And to make it level, you cut a platform into the snow. They dug into the slope, laid their skis flat as a floor, and used ski poles as supports. They cut a shelf into a snowy hillside and lay down on it. Remember that. It is going to turn out to be the most important thing anyone did that day. The last thing they wrote was not a diary entry. It was a newsletter. A single sheet called Evening Otorten, No. 1, produced in camp in the style of a Soviet wall newspaper, the kind that would be pinned up in a factory or a university corridor. It is a joke. It rags on members of the group. It teases them about romance. And it contains a mock scientific item asserting that snowmen exist. I'm going to say something about that last line now, so it does not sit there being ominous. It is a joke. It is 9 people being funny in a tent. It has been used in a great many tellings of this story as foreshadowing, as though they wrote about a yeti and then met one. They did not. They wrote a gag in a spoof newspaper, in the way that people who are cold and tired and fond of each other write gags. The original sheet has never been found. What survives in the case file is a typed copy, so even this is at one remove. It is still, I think, the best thing in the whole record. A few hours before the end of their lives, they were making each other laugh. The conditions that night are the next thing usually stated with more confidence than the evidence supports. You will see figures quoted, around -40 degrees, winds of 20 to 30 meters per second. Those are modern reconstructions and estimates. They are not instrument readings taken on that slope on that night, because nobody was taking instrument readings on that slope on that night. What we can anchor to is their own diaries. -26 on the evening of the 30th, and the general character of that place in early February. So the honest formulation is this. It was somewhere between very cold and lethally cold, and the wind was strong. The precise numbers are estimates made afterwards by people trying to model what happened. 25 days later, on the 26th of February, a search group led by a student named Boris Slobtsov found the tent. It was half collapsed and drifted over with snow. The windward side was torn open. Inside was everything. 9 rucksacks, boots and felt valenki, coats, food, the stove, the cameras, the diaries. money. Their documents. 8 pairs of skis were stacked beneath the tent. Nothing had been packed. Nothing had been taken. It did not look like people leaving. It looked like people going outside for a moment and not coming back. Now, the detail everyone knows, which I want to give you precisely, because the precise version is better than the famous version. Between the 3rd and the 16th of April, 1959, the tent was examined at the Sverdlovsk Forensic Laboratory by a senior forensic expert named Genrietta Churkina. Her report sits in Volume 1 of the criminal case file, at pages 303 to 304. She found on the right slant of the canopy, the roof panel, 3 separate cuts, 32 centimeters, 89 centimeters, 42 centimeters, made with a knife. And in her words, the nature and form of the damage indicates it was made from the inside surface of the fabric of the tent. That is the whole basis of the phrase you have heard 100 times. The tent was cut open from the inside, and it holds up. It is a proper forensic finding by a named expert, in a document with a page number. 2 corrections to the popular version, though. There were 3 cuts, not 1 dramatic slash. And the tent also had other, older damage, wear from the trip and damage from the search itself, which later retellings tend to fold into the same story. And Churkina's report says nothing whatsoever about who cut it or why. It says a knife went through that fabric from the inside. Everything beyond that is inference. Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram from Vijay when they came out, around the 12th of February. Nothing came. But delays were completely normal on trips like this. And nobody panics on the 12th. Concern built slowly through the middle of the month. An organized searching began around the 20th to the 23rd of February. When it started, it was substantial. Student volunteers from the institute, guards and officers from the Ivdel prison camps, aircraft, helicopters, and Mansi hunters, working as guides, who knew that country better than anyone alive. Remember that the Mansi were in the search parties. It matters later. The tent was found on the 26th, and leading away from it, down the slope, were footprints, 8 or 9 separate sets. They could be followed for something between 500 meters and a kilometer before the snow lost them. They survived at all because of a quirk of how snow behaves. A foot compacts the snow beneath it. The loose snow around it blows away. And what is left is the shape of the footstep standing up in relief as a small column, which tells you something in itself. The wind after they left was severe. The prints showed what people were wearing, and it was almost nothing. Slobtsov's testimony. There were footprints of bare feet, but in socks. Some were from Valenki, and occasionally we could make out the tread of a ski boot. And here is the detail that matters most, and which is almost always left out. The tracks show people walking, not running, not scattering, not fleeing in different directions. 9 sets of prints, staying together, moving downhill at a walk, and no other tracks. Nothing accompanying them, nothing following them, nothing meeting them. About 1.5 kilometers from the tent, at the tree line, stands a large Siberian pine that everyone in this story calls the cedar. Beneath it, on the 27th of February, they found the remains of a small fire and the bodies of Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both were in their underwear and socks. The cedar's branches were broken off up to about 5 meters above the ground. The hands of both men were damaged in ways consistent with climbing it. So, 2 men, dressed for a warm tent and not for a mountain, got a fire going at the tree line, and at least one of them climbed 5 meters up a frozen tree for firewood, or to see back up the slope toward the tent, or both, with hands that were already failing. They did that. Then they died there. Between the cedar and the tent, spread out along the line back up the hill, were 3 more. Igor Dyatlov, about 300 meters from the cedar. Rustem Slobodin, about 480. Zinaida Kolmogorova, about 630. The furthest up the slope of anyone. All 3 were oriented toward the tent. That distribution is, to me, the single most eloquent piece of evidence in this entire case. It requires no theory at all. 3 people tried to get back up to the tent, in stages, spread out by how much each of them had left, and none of them made it. The last 4 were not found until the 4th and 5th of May, when enough snow had melted. They were in a ravine, about 75 meters from the cedar, under roughly 4 meters of snow. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol. Near them was a den, a hollow dug out and floored with fir branches that had been cut and laid down, a deliberate shelter made by people trying to get out of the wind. And some of those 4 were wearing clothing that had belonged to Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, not taken off the living, cut from the dead with a knife. Sit with what that tells you, because it is entirely undramatic, and it is devastating. At least some of the group were alive, conscious, and thinking clearly after the first 2 men died. They went back to the bodies of their friends. They cut the clothing off them, because their friends no longer needed it, and they did. They carried it to a hollow they had dug, floored with branches they had cut. Whatever happened on that mountain, these people did not simply panic and die. They organized. They made decisions. For hours. Now we come to the part of this story that has generated almost everything strange ever written about it. I am going to go through it carefully and completely, and then we are going to move on, because the way this material is usually handled is the reason a documented hypothermia scene became a horror story. The first 5 bodies were autopsied in late February and early March. The 4 from the ravine were examined on the 9th of May, 1959, by a forensic expert named Boris Vozrojdeny, with the prosecutor, Lev Ivanov, and the expert Churkina present. 3 of the 4 had serious injuries. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had an extensive depressed fracture of the skull, splintered across the vault and the base. Lyudmila Dubinina had bilateral rib fractures, the 2nd to 5th ribs on the right, the 2nd to 7th on the left, with bleeding into the muscles between them. and a hemorrhage about 4 centimeters square into the left ventricle of her heart. She died of massive internal bleeding from blunt force trauma inflicted while she was still alive. Semyon Zolotaryov had multiple rib fractures on one side, and now the finding that governs everything else. None of these injuries had corresponding external wounds. The skin over them was unbroken. Vozrojdeny was asked about this directly in an interrogation on the 28th of May. Could another person have done this? Struck Thibaut Brignol with a rock? He said no. A blow like that leaves soft tissue damage, and there was none. What he reached for instead was a comparison. The injuries resembled those of a person struck by a fast-moving car. That is the finding any explanation has to match. Enormous force, enough to splinter a skull and break ribs on both sides of a chest, delivered without breaking the skin. It is why the theories about someone attacking these people fail. They do not fail because they are outlandish. They fail on the primary medical evidence written down in 1959 by the man who did the examination. There is one more detail from those reports, and I'm going to give it to you once, properly, and then not return to it. Lyudmila Dubinina's body was missing her tongue, her eyes, and some of the soft tissue of her face. This single fact is the engine of nearly every sensational theory attached to this case. So here is the forensic reality. She was found lying face down in a stream running beneath the snow at the bottom of that ravine. She had been there for approximately 3 months. The eyes, tongue, and lips are the softest, most vascular, least protected tissue on a human body, and in any decomposition, they are the first to go. Prolonged immersion in cold running water accelerates that loss and carries the tissue away. Scavengers, in water and on land, take those tissues preferentially. The 1959 report itself attributes the loss to rot and decay in a body that had been underwater. And all 4 of the bodies in that ravine showed soft tissue loss and discoloration, because all 4 had spent the same 3 months in the same snow and the same water. Nothing was done to her. Time and water did it. That is the whole of it, and we are moving on. Radiation. Some of the clothing was tested and found to carry contamination. Dubinina's brown sweater measured around 9,900 decays per minute across 150 square centimeters. Some of Kolevatov's clothing measured 5 to 5,500. Rinsing the garments cut the readings by between 30 and 60%, which tells you it was dust sitting on the surface rather than anything within the fabric. The radiologist concluded the levels were above what would be normal even for people working with radioactive materials, and could not determine how they got there. Here is the mundane explanation, and it is very likely the right one. Yuri Krivonishenko worked at Chelyabinsk 40, the facility now known as Mayak. In September 1957, Mayak suffered what we now call the Kishtim disaster, a major radiological accident that contaminated something like 23,000 square kilometers of the southern Urals. Krivonishenko was involved in the cleanup. Kolevatov had worked with radioactive materials in Moscow, and hiking groups share clothing constantly. A jumper is a jumper. It gets lent, swapped, slept in by whoever is coldest. 2 men who had worked around radioactive material in a group of 9 who shared their clothes. I should be honest that this is a sufficient explanation rather than a proven one. The case file never resolved it. The authors of the modern avalanche work explicitly declined to address it. It is one of the genuinely open threads. In late May of 1959, the prosecutor, Lev Ivanov, closed the case. His formula was that the group had died as a result of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. That phrase is one of the disputed translations I mentioned. The Russian has been rendered as compelling, elemental, overwhelming, and spontaneous. Those are meaningfully different words in English, and a great deal of mythology has been built in the gap between them. The file was archived and access restricted. In 1990, Ivanov said publicly that he had been ordered to close the case and classify the findings. That is usually where the quotation stops. He also, in the same period, advanced a theory of his own involving luminous spheres, which is a retired investigator's opinion offered 30 years later, not evidence, and which tends to get quietly dropped by the people who quote the first half. And now the part of the official record that I think deserves more attention than the injuries ever get. The first working theory was murder, and the first suspects were the Mansi. The Mansi are the indigenous people of that region, reindeer herders and hunters. In March of 1959, investigators interrogated men from the Anyamov, Kurikov, and Batyarov families. Several were detained. Investigators went looking for a sacred site the hikers might have trespassed on the theory that the group had been killed for violating it. Here is what the investigation actually found. Only the hikers' own footprints. No third-party tracks of any kind. No sign of a struggle, at the tent or on the bodies. And testimony from local Russians in their defense. One resident, Mikhail Mokrushin, who had lived there since 1945. There was no case of Mansi attacking strangers. On the contrary, visitors often take natives as guides. The detained men were formally cleared and released within the year, and the line of inquiry was closed. Two things about that, which I want to state plainly rather than leave as atmosphere. The first is that this was a false accusation, not an unproven theory, not an intriguing possibility that lingers. An indigenous community was suspected of mass murder on no evidence. Men were detained, and the investigation itself established there were no other tracks on that mountain. That is a documented wrong done to real people, and it should be reported as one. The second is that while some of their men were being detained, other Mansi were out in the snow helping to search for the bodies. The people accused of the killings were among the people looking for the dead. There is a record that a Mansi deputy named Grigory Kurikov skied all the way to Sverdlovsk to petition the authorities for the release of the detained men. That is a better story than the theory ever was, and almost nobody tells it. Let me deal briefly with the rest, because they can be handled quickly and without contempt for anyone who finds them appealing. The Yeti. This rests on a joke in a spoof newsletter and on a blurred photograph. The famous frame 34, a smear of light in darkness, which the case archive explains as an artifact of the film being wound during development. No search protocol recorded a single non-human track. Unidentified craft. This rests on the same photograph and on scattered reports of luminous spheres over the region that winter, which are consistent with rocket launches from Baikonur. A secret weapons test. There is no crater, no blast pattern, no burns beyond what a campfire accounts for. and the injuries are compression injuries without external wounds, which is close to the opposite of a blast signature. State assassination. This one requires the Soviet state to murder 9 people and then organize a 3-month public search involving hundreds of civilian volunteers, while leaving 8 diaries and every camera in the tent untouched. For 60 years, that was where it stood. A closed file, a restricted archive, and a phrase about a natural force nobody had specified. Then 2 things happened. In February 2019, the Russian Prosecutor General's office reopened an inquiry. The deputy chief in charge, Andrei Kuryakov, announced at the outset that he would examine 3 natural causes: avalanche, snow slab, and hurricane. Critics pointed out, reasonably, that deciding in advance to consider only 3 natural explanations rather determines the shape of your answer. In July of 2020, they announced their conclusion: an avalanche. A snow slab drove the group from the tent into heavy snow and near 0 visibility. They descended, they dug a shelter, and a second snow event struck them in the ravine. On the injuries, Kuryakov's reasoning was about mass. 3 or 4 meters of snow above you is roughly half a ton, and it presses from a direction that leaves the damage where the autopsies found it. The Dyatlov Foundation and the families rejected the finding. They still do. I want to be careful to characterize that as a disagreement, which it is, rather than as evidence of a cover-up, which it is not. And then, on the 28th of January, 2021, 62 years to the day after the group left Sverdlovsk, 2 engineers published a paper in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin are avalanche and soil mechanics specialists at institutions in Switzerland. Their paper is not about mysteries. It is about whether a slab of snow can fail on a shallow slope and what happens to a human body when it does. Here is what they showed. The first problem had always been the slope angle. The ground above the tent averages about 23 degrees, and slab avalanches are not supposed to happen on 23 degrees. But the average is misleading. The buried weak layer within the snowpack sits at about 28 degrees, and the ground surface beneath reaches 30 in places. Later, snowfall had smoothed the whole thing over, so the slope looks gentler than it is. That is the paper's central geometric insight, and once you have it, the objection dissolves. The second piece is the platform. To pitch a 4.5-meter tent, they excavated a shelf perhaps 6.5 to 7.5 meters wide into the snow, beneath a topographic shoulder about 100 meters above them. Cutting into a slope like that severs the slab and leaves a free face, which is the classic precondition for a release. The third piece is the wind. Katabatic winds, cold air draining downhill, deposited wind-packed snow above the cut through the night, adding something between 1/4 and just under 1/2 meter of load. And the fourth piece is the one I find genuinely elegant. The slab does not fail when you cut it. It fails when enough new snow has piled onto it. Their model predicts failure between about 7 and 13.5 hours after the cut was made. The forensic estimate of how long the group lived after their last meal, arrived at completely independently in 1959, is 9.5 to 13.5 hours. Those two ranges overlap, which explains the thing that had never made sense. How an avalanche could hit in the middle of the night with no storm happening at that moment and leave no trace for searchers 3 weeks later. Because it was small. Their modelled slab is about 5 meters by 9 here, half a meter thick at the cut, and thinning to 1/10 of that, moving at around 2 meters per second. It travels a short distance and stops. This is not a wall of snow roaring down a mountain. It is a heavy block sliding a few meters onto people who are lying down, on skis, which is to say, on a rigid, unyielding surface. And that geometry is what produces the injuries. The paper's plausibility rests on old automotive impact experiments using cadavers, which established what degree of chest compression produces which fractures. A load applied slowly and spread widely through clothing against a hard backing breaks ribs and skulls without breaking skin, which is exactly what Vozrojdeny described in 1959 and could not account for. And yes, the snow simulation they adapted for the impact modelling was originally developed to animate the snow in Disney's Frozen. That is true, and it is the detail every retelling leads with. It is a footnote to a serious piece of engineering, and I would rather leave it as one. Now, what does the avalanche not explain? I want to answer that using the author's own words, because it is very rare and very much to their credit. Gaume and Puzrin state in the paper that their work does not address the radioactivity on the clothing, that it does not explain the behavior of the hikers after they left the tent, that it does not account for the locations and the states of the bodies, that the model is two-dimensional and does not simulate individual ribs, that it cannot account for later impacts in the ravine. Their own sentence: we do not explain nor address other controversial elements surrounding the investigation. Two men produced the best available physical explanation of this event, and then told you precisely how much of it they had not explained. Most of the rest is explained by something less exotic than any of it: the medical literature on freezing to death. There is a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. In advanced hypothermia, the blood vessels near the skin, which have been clamped shut to preserve core heat, suddenly fail and open. Blood rushes to the surface, and the person experiences an overwhelming sensation of burning heat and takes their clothes off. A German forensic review of 69 fatal hypothermia cases found it in about a quarter of them. That is Krivonishenko and Doroshenko in their underwear, beside a fire they had built themselves. There is a second phenomenon called terminal burrowing. In the final stage, something at the level of the brainstem drives the dying person into small enclosed spaces, under furniture, into cupboards, into hollows. That is the den in the ravine. And here is the detail that ought to be better known than it is. Forensic pathologists have written explicitly about how often hypothermia deaths get mistaken for homicides. Undressed bodies concealed in confined spaces, read as assault and murder by investigators who did not know what freezing does to people. The Dyatlov Pass incident may be the largest and most famous example of that misreading in existence. Though it is not the whole picture, and I want to be fair to the evidence in both directions, some of that group were found wearing more clothing than they set out in, cut carefully from the dead. That is not the behavior of someone in the last confusion of hypothermia. That is someone thinking. Both things are true at once. Some of them were still reasoning, and some of them were past it. That is what a scene like this actually looks like. There is one more idea worth mentioning, because it is in the best-known book about the case. In Dead Mountain, published in 2013, Donnie Eichar proposed that wind moving over the dome of the mountain generated a Kármán vortex street, a regular train of alternating vortices, producing infrasound that induced panic and drove the group out of the tent. I will be straightforward. Specialists do not take this very seriously. It has not been peer-reviewed. There is no demonstration that this specific landform under these conditions would produce such a thing, and the underlying literature on infrasound causing panic in humans is thin and contested. I mention it because Eichar's book is genuinely valuable. He interviewed Yuri Yudin, he did real work, and he put the primary documents in front of English-speaking readers for the first time. The weakest part of a good book is still the weakest part. So what remains? We do not know why they left the tent. The avalanche model gives a plausible trigger, but the footprints show 9 people walking downhill together, in order. And that is not obviously what people do when a slab of snow has just landed on them. We do not know why they went 1.5 kilometers down to the tree line, rather than 15 meters to their own boots and skis. We do not know where the radiation came from. Krivonishenko's work at Mayak and shared clothing is a sufficient explanation and has never been a proven one. We do not know whether the second set of injuries in the ravine came from another slide, a fall, or something else. And we do not know the sequence. Who died first, and in what order, and what each of them knew. The bodies allow a reconstruction. They do not allow certainty. Here is where I think the honest position sits. There is now a physically coherent, peer-reviewed, entirely natural account of what most likely happened on that slope. It explains the shallow angle. It explains the delay. It explains the injuries that could not be explained for 60 years. It requires nothing beyond snow, wind, and the ordinary consequences of cutting a shelf into a hillside. And the 2 men who built it are the ones telling you how much of the evidence it leaves untouched. The case is explained. It is not solved. The distance between those 2 words is the whole of this story. And it is where I think we should leave it. Not because there is a secret still hiding in it, but because that gap is simply what the truth looks like when the people who could have closed it died 67 years ago on a cold hillside. They are buried together in Yekaterinburg. Yuri Yudin, the one who turned back with a bad leg on the 28th of January, the one who was photographed embracing Lyudmila Dubinina before he went, visited them for 54 years. He spent much of his life pressing for answers about the case, and he died in 2013 without getting them. He was buried with his friends. I find I do not think about the injuries, or the theories, or the file. I think about the newsletter. Evening Otorten, number 1. A single typed sheet, made up in a tent on a mountainside, teasing each other about who fancied whom, with a joke in it about snowmen. 9 people, most of them barely into their 20s, at the end of a long, hard day of doing something difficult that they had chosen to do, making each other laugh. That is the part of this that is actually true, and completely certain, and not disputed by anyone. Sleep well,